Welcome to Let's Talk It Out. I'm Daphne Harris and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about interaction with the police, and I have a very special guest on my show, Brian Nugent. Introduce yourself. Tell them what you do and where you work at.
So my name is Brian Nugent. I'm the Deputy Chief of Police here in Avon, Indiana. I've been in that position for about 10 years, and I've been in law enforcement overall for a little over 20 years right now. So it's been quite a career so far. Hit that 20-year mark, which is a big benchmark for law enforcement officers' careers, but spent all of that time right here in Avon and gotten to know a lot of good people, yourself included. So I appreciate you having me here.
Well, good. Congratulations, and thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. Brian and I, we have a unique friendship. I met you about, 9-10 years ago?
Yeah, close to 10 years ago.
And when I met Brian, he came to my house with another officer. At the time, he was a detective.
That's right.
And he came to my house because at the time, my oldest son had gotten into some trouble. And when you came to my house, I can't remember if you had a warrant. I believe you did have a warrant.
Yes.
And
yeah.
So when you came to my house, I just remember it was at nighttime, and you knocked on the door, and we can always tell when it's the police. And I just remember telling my husband, I was like, it's the police at the door. But also being a mother, I immediately knew it was one of my kids.
Yeah.
But it was a worry, like not thinking they was into some trouble.
Sure.
But when you came in, you told me that you had a warrant. Mm-hmm. You told my husband and I that you had a warrant, you and your partner that you were with.
Yes.
But you were extremely nice. A lot of times you see on TV or we assume when you have a warrant, you just come into the house gun blazing, or you get to ramshack through the house. But you didn't conduct yourself that way. You treated us with a lot of respect. You told us who you were, and I felt safe and comfortable allowing you to come into our house.
Yeah, good deal.
And so when you told me what was going on, I'm still like in awe, not realizing it wasn't registering to me what you were saying.
Right.
But when you told me who you were there for, being the mother that I am,
sure.
My son was not there at the time.
Right.
So not only did I tell him my son wasn't there, but I knew where my son was.
Yeah.
So I took you to where he was.
That's right.
The first thing that I said to him, he's going to give you the same amount of respect that you gave us.
Yes, absolutely.
And so it went from there. Our friendship continued.
Yeah, absolutely.
So is that normally how it is when you go to someone's house with a warrant? Like, what is the procedure?
Yeah, it really kind of depends on what the underlying case is, right? So for me, having been the detective in that investigation, I had a lot of information, and it kind of helped guide me on what I was getting ready to encounter. Before we knock on your door, we find out kind of who you are, where you work at. We have to educate ourselves on kind of what situation that we're walking into. Now, on some incidents where it's more high risk, right, where we believe there's weapons in the home, or we believe there's people that have resisted law enforcement, that's when you might start to see a little bit more of what might be called like a heavy-handed approach, where we're maybe a little bit more gruff, or we have to knock on the door, we might ask you to step outside. You might see more marked police cars and all of that sort of stuff taking place. But for us, it's always been, what are we doing to educate ourselves on the situation that we're going into? And so I've just always found that the more kindness and the more respect that we've shown people, that actually helps us be more effective at our jobs. And there are times where we need to be very direct. There's times where we need to be very much just all business interaction. Mm-hmm. But I think for the most part, we really kind of pride ourselves in this profession to knowing that we don't always have to have the same response every single time.
Right.
So our protocol it has some flexibility in it, right? And we're not required to bring a SWAT team in. We're not required to do certain things. And a lot of those teams actually have their own scoring mechanisms by which they would say, hey, tell us all about the facts of your case. Mm-hmm. And SWAT teams will look at that and say, you know what, this just doesn't really seem to be that high risk of a situation. And a lot of times those SWAT teams will stand down and say, we just don't think that we're an adequate use of your resources on deploying on this house. So it's more having a holistic approach to everything, being mindful, but also being open-minded. I think that's really what helped our exchange become so amicable, you know what I mean?
Right. So, because when you came to our house, you had a warrant to search the house.
We did.
And the thing that was so rare, and I'm not saying that you're rare, but you did not search our home. Oh, you asked us if we had any weapons, and his first response was, yes, I have weapons. Let me go upstairs and get them. And I remember we all stood up and said, no. Yeah. But you don't get that response. You go to someone's house and you have a warrant. Mm. Like, what is the interaction of the people when they open the door? What is it? What is their role and their rights? So, for the purposes of law enforcement, anytime that we have a search warrant, it's because we've given an affidavit. So an affidavit is just a document that we type out. We say, here's what we did, here's what we saw, here's what we know, here's what witnesses are telling us. It may include things like surveillance videos or security cameras have captured this kind of a genesis of events, and we give that to a judge. Mm-hmm. So in order to even have a search warrant, a judge has already reviewed all of that information. All the evidence. So by the time we park our cars and we walk up to the front door, a judge has already looked at every single thing that we've looked at as the law enforcement officer to that moment. Mm-hmm. Now there's always, and I always use the phrase, check and adjust, right? We always have to be able... Basically means check the status of what we didn't have information from earlier, mm-hmm. and adjust our approach. Okay. So for example, if we were to make an approach on a home and we didn't suspect that we were going to get a nasty attitude, or we didn't suspect we were going to deal with weapons, if I got out of the car and the very first thing that would happen is someone came on the porch with a gun in their hand and said, get the hell off my property, I'm going to have to realize maybe we need to adjust our approach, right? Maybe we're going to stay out by the street. We're now going to have to escalate kind of what we're doing, because we're trying to make sure that we can diminish, or in a lot of ways de-escalate that sort of aggression. Mm-hmm. For us, anytime that we have a warrant, so, and this is a very national standard, mm-hmm. is there's a difference between a no-knock warrant and a knock warrant, right? Okay. So as an example, you really start to hear this conversation in drug-related cases. For a no-knock warrant? For a no-knock warrant. In order to get a no-knock warrant, you have to have a lot of different special circumstances to put in front of a judge, and that judge would actually identify your warrant to say, you're allowed to execute this warrant, and when you do so, you don't have to knock on the door and tell them who you are. That's a very dangerous thing for law enforcement. And that was my next question, because with a no-knock warrant, it almost seems like a license to kill. It's very, very dangerous, and a lot of times... More so for the person that you're serving the warrant on. Yes. Because when you... It's almost like common sense. And is it legal? Is it like a national law, or is it in some states it's legal and some states it's not legal? So it stepped in, the courts that stepped in and really took a position on this is the United States Supreme Court. So it doesn't matter if it's in Indiana, or if it's Kentucky, California, New York, anywhere across the country. When we start dealing with what we call case law, that's a case law that's usually adjudicated by a federal court somewhere. Now there are different parts of the map and different federal jurisdictions, and some groups have different rules. But when something of this level starts to hit the United States Supreme Court, that's whenever the United States Supreme Court says, well, they don't care what anyone else in this country says as far as courts, they are the Supreme Court. And their ruling is very clear, and it applies to everybody at every level. There's a lot of discussion about how dangerous a no-knock warrant is. We also live in a world of what we call best practices, right? Mm-hmm. So best practice means, yeah, you could do this. Yeah, you could probably do that. But what's the right thing to do? What's the safest thing to do? And for us, it's about what's the right decision based on the information that you have at hand. And that information is always changing. And when it changes, we have to check where we're at, and we adjust our approach every time. Right, because if a person has, a license to carry a gun, mm-hmm. and no matter what the circumstances are, it could be the right house, it can be the wrong house, you have a order from the judge that it's okay to go in and do the no-knock warrant. Yeah. But in so many cases, it seems like it always ends wrong, because you're a police officer, but you're also a father and a husband. So if someone busts in your house in the middle of the night, your first reaction is not only to protect yourself, but also to protect your family. That's right. So if you're waking up out your sleep, mm-hmm. you're going to... It's almost like when you're asleep, your first, what is it called? It's your instinct is to just protect yourself.
Yeah.
But so many times it seems like with the no-knock warrant, it always goes wrong. And so why is that legal? And is that something that your precinct,
our agency,
do you guys do that often, the no-knock warrant? And have you, when you were a detective, did you have to serve a no-knock warrant?
Well, during my time with the agency now, over the last 20 plus years, I've been in this position now to where I've kind of seen this no-knock sort of approach be taken by our Supreme Court and by our other federal courts and state courts. And so when I first came into the profession, there really was not much of a distinction. It was kind of left at the officers when they made contact, whether or not they announced that they were law enforcement or they just kicked the door open. And you started to see tragedies. You started seeing people getting hurt. You started seeing officers getting hurt. And I think that's what kind of leads to all of the different court rulings where people have said, let's sit down and talk about this. And let's talk about why we would ever need to have a no-knock warrant. So as an example, if you have somebody who you think that you're looking to apprehend, they maybe have an arrest warrant for them, but they are believed to be a very high legitimate risk to harming other people. That could play in how you decide to take them into custody. Sometimes it might be better to wait for them to get into the vehicle and then stop them on a vehicle stop and try to approach them from a regular traffic stop scenario and get them into custody. Some people might have a different type of informational packet that suggests they never leave the house. So what's the safest way? Well, maybe we're going to wait and we're going to watch people coming and going until we're convinced that that's the only person in the house. And then they would make their approach. So there's a lot of intelligence that goes into that, right? Trying to research what that looks like. But I tell you, over 99% of the time, these no-knock warrants are very rare. Yeah, those are not good situations for most people. So think about your high risk, the worst of the worst, anything that could jeopardize officer safety, occupant safety. Those are really what drives the opportunities to have a no-knock warrant. I couldn't tell you the last time we ever had a no-knock warrant, to be honest with you.
With the election and everything that's going on, the election coming up, you know, division is at an all-time high.
Yeah.
And, you know, right now, you know, with Trump running as the president, his main thing is to give police officers back their power. And when people of color hear this, you know, we're already afraid.
Sure.
You know, we already feel like it's you know, we don't stand a chance when it comes to the police in defending ourselves. So do you feel like police officers have lost their power?
I think police officers have lost respect. That's what I think it is, and I think
lost respect for.
They've had the respect of people respecting law enforcement has been lost, but for a number of reasons, right? So we take, for example, I mean, the big thing that we talk about quite a bit right now is the whole situation with George Floyd. I don't know of a single officer that I've ever known, have spoken with since that's happened, that ever watched what had actually unfolded and thought that there was no problem with that. It was disgusting in every element. To see that happen. So as I sit here talking to you today, I can speak from my own experiences. I can expound upon the idea of what's happening in the people that I engage. But I think what the crux of the issue is that whenever I grew up, there was a pretty good relevance, or prevalence, I should say, of respecting authority.
Yes.
And when you start adding all the politics and everything, oh my gosh. It's just disgusting.
Exactly. It just adds fuel to the fire.
It really does.
And that's the reason I always tell my kids, you know, as a black mother, we're always having the conversation. I have it with my husband all the time. You know, I'm always saying comply, comply, comply.
Yeah.
And that's not me saying, you know, situations that have happened is you know, that person's fault. You know, this person isn't here or this happened because that person didn't comply. That's not what I'm saying at all.
Sure.
I just think that interaction with the police is so important. Like, it's not a guarantee that you're going to make it home safely. But it is a 50-50 chance that you're going to better your chances of getting home. Sure. And I'm always telling my kids, you know, I don't care what your rights are. I just want you to make it home safely.
Yeah.
So when I met you, you were a detective.
Yes.
So now you're a deputy chief. Deputy chief.
Yeah.
Okay, so how many black officers do you have in the Avon Police Department?
So our agency is 35 officers from top to bottom as far as sworn officers that we have. At one point we had 2 black male officers, and at this point we have 1. Another gentleman that we had hired about 3 years ago decided he didn't want to get into law enforcement here in Central Indiana. He then took a position in law enforcement down in southern Indiana. And so I've really spent a lot of time trying to understand how difficult it is to attract minorities into the job. And the one officer that we do have, he works a pretty advanced level of investigations for us here at Avon. And he and I have had some very candid conversations about this. And I've told him, I've said, tell me
about black people becoming police officers.
Yeah, and we've talked about it. I've talked to him before about what sort of things can we do to be more attractive to that demographic. We want people to know that they're welcome in this profession, and we do have a lot of minority applicants that apply for our agency. And surprisingly enough, their feedback that I've gotten from him, the other officer that used to work with us as well, was I just don't think culturally minorities really want to do this job. And so there's a lot of push from people to hire minorities, and we do make those efforts as much as we possibly can. The one thing that, while it still frustrates some people, it's just the reality of where we're at, is in order for us to hire you, you have to pass a physical agility, you have to pass a written exam, you have to pass an interview panel, and you have to pass a background. And
there are no black people that passed that.
We had about 15 to 20% turnout for minority applicants. And, you know, the idea is that there's nothing in that hiring process.
That's what the Avon Police
That's what Avon PD, yeah. But there's nothing in that process that empowers anybody to score higher because of their race. There's nothing in that process that reduces anyone's scores because of their race as well. So we are really proud about how objective our hiring process is. You have to take the exam. You have to get a passing score. You have to do the push-ups and the sit-ups and the vertical jump and the 1.5 miles and the 300-meter sprint. You have to do that. It's just that simple.
Can you have a felony?
You cannot have a felony. So a felony would preclude you from being able to be in possession of a firearm. And that's a federal law that's been out for years, and obviously the state of Indiana follows that as well. And so just based on the fact of that restriction alone, you would be precluded, i.e. excluded, from being able to be a part of that process. And so we are very intentional about who we're trying to reach out to. We open up our application period probably longer than anybody here in the county. And we know that the person or persons that are applying for our agency, they're paying attention to things like Facebook. They're paying attention to things like Instagram. They're keeping an open eye to see which agencies are out there, at least outwardly, showing that they care about the community. And so that's why it's important for us to do things like this and to have these conversations and to have public events and to be out there and just let people know, look, we understand there's bad apples out there.
Avon is hiring.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly a big part of it.
With Avon Police Department having only one black officer, how do you train your officers to interact with the black community? And the second question is, how do you weed out the officers who are racist? Well, just to have a badge to kill someone black. Like, how do you weed that out?
So, two questions, right? So the two issues that we're talking about here is the selection, who we're hiring to be on the job, and the other part is what are we doing to kind of make sure that the officers that we do hire kind of follow the right path, right? So it's kind of two different issues. So I'll start off by first talking about how we do the officer selection. So once you pass the physical agility, the written exam, and our interview panel, you go through a background. And we are very, very proud of how difficult our backgrounds are at our agency. And when I say difficult, I don't necessarily mean it takes forever. I mean, it's a very thorough background. When we have you come into the interview room, we're going to ask you and interview you for probably about 4 hours. We're going to talk to you about every aspect of your background. We're going to talk about your upbringing. We're going to talk about substance abuse. We're going to talk about financial histories. We're going to talk about some things that are very uncomfortable to talk about. Maybe you've been the victim of a crime. Maybe it's been a terribly insensitive crime, things that have really impacted you. But we're also going to ask a lot of questions about your work history. We're going to talk about any conflicts you've had with people. How did you resolve those? We do have a lot of questions where we talk about bias. We have a lot of conversations where we talk about, as a position that you've had as a previous employee, have you ever been counseled, disciplined, or otherwise interviewed because of comments you made about someone's race, religion, creed, any of those sort of topics there. So we really dive into those. And I can tell you that after about 3 to 4 hours of interviewing somebody, by the time you get to those questions, you got a pretty good understanding of what an honest response is and what's something that's different. So beyond that interview, we will interview everybody you worked with, every single job. If you came to us and you're 25 years old and you wanted to do this job and you had 8 places that you worked at, we will call every single place that you worked at. We will reach out to every person that you work for as a boss. We'll talk to your neighbors. We're going to talk to your teachers. We're going to talk to your friends. We might even find some people that probably don't like you and have a conversation with them as well. For us, it's about documenting all of that. So whenever we have somebody that we bring on board, we put all of that facts and circumstances together and we give it to our merit board. So what a merit board is for us is it's a 5-person panel that sits on a committee together, and these 5 individuals are the ones that ultimately decide whether or not someone gets a job offer from our agency. And most agencies have a merit board. Most agencies call them merit boards. Some people call them board of police commissioners. These are civilians that live in the very communities that these officers are sworn to protect and serve towards. And they actually review these packets in detail, and they get to see every question during that 4-hour block of what we're asking and what they're saying. They also have the ability to say, you know, I have some questions about this applicant, or there's something that I saw here that makes me uncomfortable. Can we look into this a little bit further? And we would do that because that's who we actually have to present that to. So at the end of the day, your police chiefs aren't even the ones that are actually hiring your people. They're bringing them to you as a recommendation. Okay. But there are 5 people here in Avon. Some places, depending on population, might have a bigger merit commission or a bigger board that kind of does that. So that's the first part of your question, right? Who are we hiring? What are we doing to make sure we're not hiring a bad apple?
Right.
Obviously, it includes things like criminal history checks. We're going to make sure we're looking at social media. If you have something that's posted on social media that gives us any inclination that you have sort of that apprehension, we're going to move on past you. We don't tolerate that. We simply don't tolerate it. It's easier for us to control it as a smaller agency. And I think that's when we start getting into some bigger conversations, when you start paying attention to, think about how difficult that could be if you were NYPD, Chicago PD, LAPD, just talking huge agencies where they may not always have the time or sometimes the capacity, right? The number of people needed to do X, Y, and Z efficiently. IMPD is a great example, a much larger agency. And when you start taking larger agencies like that, they're not just trying to fill 1 or 2 spots. They might be trying to fill 20 or 40 or 50 spots. And so now you have the pressures of hiring somebody coupled with the inability to kind of make sure you're checking all the nooks and crannies of a person's background. And sometimes that's when people who are ill-intended can find themselves kind of squeaking in the back door of getting into one of these agencies. And so to your first part of that question, though, is what do you do once they're there?
Right.
So we have a field training manual. And that's a document that we have continued to develop as an agency over the last several years. And that's a document that not only shows you how to do the job, it shows you how we want you to do the job. And so throughout that entire manual, we talk about how to assimilate with people that are different, trying to find something in common. If I walk into a gas station and I see an individual that just maybe doesn't really like me, I can just tell they see me in the uniform and rolling their eyes or turning their head. How do I respond to that?
Right.
You know, their appropriate response is to just wave. Hey, how are you doing today?
But most officers, well, I'm not going to say most officers. A lot of officers do not respond that way.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And that's, in my opinion, that's a reflection on the institutional culture of that agency. Right? So that was an example of how I would encourage someone to respond. Say, hey, how you doing? But there's some agencies that have a culture that officers will come in and they might see a person, look at them and not, you know, shake their head or whatever. And their response might be, what's your problem?
Now they want a confrontation.
Yeah. And now if I give you that confrontation, I'm now making that twice as bad as it was to begin with, right? But sometimes it's just that culture. And we really believe culture is the crux of changing all of that. And culture is very, very difficult to mold, right? It's very difficult to change, but it's also very difficult to mold.
So when responding to a 911 call, how do you respond to mental health? And do you have a certain department in your agency that answers those calls? Because it seems like whenever if you call 911, and for black people, a lot of times anymore, calling 911 is the last resort.
Yeah.
You know, and so when we call 911, say someone is having a mental crisis and they're out of their mind, they have a knife, they're just waving it everywhere. You know, how do you handle those calls, and who comes out to keep, you know, the officer from shooting this person just because they have a knife?
There are so many factors that go into what your question is, so I want to be responsible and try to hit on a couple of those real quick. So the first thing that we have to be mindful of is when that 911 call is placed and that call is given to a dispatcher and they start taking information, a lot of times officers are not informed of a mental health situation. A lot of times when those calls come in, People are nervous. They are excited, not necessarily in a positive way, but they're amped up, right? They're up and running. And when that starts to happen, usually the only information that comes in the last, probably minute or two of that conversation before an officer starts driving to the scene is, I have a call of a man with a knife. So regardless of what the underlying circumstance is, right? Whether it's a guy who's got mental health issues, whether it's an individual who is in crisis of some sort, the reality is that person, regardless of the reason why, still presents a clear, obvious threat to others, right? The fact that someone is having a mental health crisis is certainly a part of that, and we understand that. But for us as a department, it changes very little about how we have to get to the scene. We're going to run lights and siren. We're trying to get there as fast as we can. When we get there, we have to determine what's going on. And a lot of times, I don't have time to say, hey, how are you doing today? Right? A lot of those times when I get out of the car, I have to say, did you call? Where is he at? Right? It's very much not as personable as what our relationship had started off with when I came to your house with a search warrant. So when we start engaging people at that level, now outwardly we look like we're insensitive. We look like we don't care. But that's
because you have a gun and that person has a knife or a pen or just going crazy.
And it's hard. It's a very challenging circumstance. So one of the things that we have talked about as a department was, what can we do before we even get to the scene? Right? So one of the things we talk about a lot is what's called a hazard. So your address, your home, my home. If I have anybody who has any sort of a cognitive disorder, has a mental health condition, if you would, you have the ability to notify the dispatch center and put a note into the address. And that note would be something very small. It would say, hey, this is where Brian lives at. If anyone responds to Brian's house, he has, maybe I have a son who has a mental health disorder, and I have a daughter who is suicidal, or I myself, the father is, I got a lot of weapons in the home. And now the moment that you call, even for a noise complaint on something across the street, those hazard notes will appear on that computer inside that police car.
And that's how it's supposed to be handled.
Supposed to be handled.
But most times.
But here's the problem that we deal with sometimes. A lot of times, and I'm sure this is similar in a lot of different jobs, is kind of people living in a world where they say, well, that's not my job. So as another example, we talk about mental health. Something that we did here in Avon is we created what's called the AWARE program. And so this is a program we created about 3 years ago, and it's simply a sticker. It's a circular shaped sticker that we created. And the concept behind it is, if you or anybody in your family has a cognitive disorder, so think about people that are bipolar, people that are schizophrenic, people that just have some sort of a diagnosis that might look to be an officer like they might be impaired, or it might look like they're trying to lie to you, or they're not very quick on their responses. If I were to ask you your date of birth, most people would usually respond relatively quickly. But for some people that have developmental delay, and we're talking mental health again here, right? They might say, I might say, hey, when's your date of birth? And they pause for 4 or 5 seconds, and they look around the room, and then they rattle off a date. I might be inclined as the officer to think, well, you just made that up.
Or you're drunk.
Or you're intoxicated, right? Some sort of an impairment level. So we have identified a sticker. We've produced them now. You can go to our website. You can tell people, hey, I want one of these stickers. And we'll bring one. We'll put it on your front door, and we'll put it on the back window of your car for you.
And how many people do that, though? And that's your agency, because with so many of these other agencies, in the real world, that's just not happening.
Right.
It's so much goes wrong. When an officer pulls someone over, are they required to tell that person why they're being stopped?
So in most states, the answer is no. In most states, it's not really something that's codified, so it's not written in a law somewhere that states that you have to inform them. Most agencies will have a policy that will state that when you make a vehicle stop, you're to identify yourself, identify the reason for your stop, and request their documents. Some policies are written a little differently, where they state you are compelled to identify yourself and actually order them to turn over the documents that they have to. So you're taking driver's license, registration, proof of insurance, and then at that point the officer can then explain to you why they've stopped you. So there's a lot of differences between laws and policies, and that's sometimes where you might get a different experience.
So it's not law, it's just policy.
Yes, exactly, especially in Indiana. There's nowhere in Indiana law that states that when you make a vehicle stop that you're compelled to tell them. And we see this a lot too. We see people that get pulled over.
Why did you stop me? I don't have to tell you, it's the debate. And, I'm always telling my kids, comply. And I joke with them, and I instill it in them. Like, even now with them being adults, I'm always telling them to where they just get tired of me telling them. I'm like, I don't care if the police officer tell you to get out and do jumping jacks. Get out and do jumping jacks. I just want you to come home. So what would be the reason that an officer asks you to step out of the car? And if officer asks you to step out of your car, do you have to? Legally, do you have to? It's best to, but
legally you're required to. So there are some very specific case laws rendered by the United States Supreme Court that specify during a vehicle stop that the officer has the authority to order people out of the vehicle. Now, interestingly enough, it's not a great practice to order people out of the vehicle, because now I have to divide my attention between somebody who's on foot and everybody else inside the vehicle. So you are compelled to do that when an officer orders you to do so. If you refuse to do so, the law is going to be with law enforcement that they can take you out by force and handcuff you and charge you with resisting law enforcement if that's the case. Most cops don't want to do that. I promise you.
Anything is considered resisting arrest.
It can be, yeah. And that's the thing. There's two different types of resisting. There's passive resisting and there's active resisting, right? So passive resistance is more of a situation.
Make the officer upset.
Sort of. I see what you did. Passive, think passive is you're just trying to get away from me, right? I'm trying to get your hand behind your back to put handcuffs on, and you're just trying to get away, right? The active resisting is you're striking me and trying to get away. So that's a little differently in Indiana. We call that battery on an officer versus resisting. But we have to be able to demonstrate what that is as an officer, documenting what that looks like. So you are, as an officer, you do have the ability and the authority to order people out of the car. You talked a little bit about what circumstances would they ask you to do that. There's a terminology that's used in the United States Supreme Court. We call it furtive gestures. So a furtive gesture is anything that looks like you and I might just call it suspicious. If I was sitting in the front seat of a car and you're parked behind me in your police car and you see me leaning down under my seat,
it looks suspicious.
And I keep leaning down under my seat, or maybe I keep jumping over to the glove box, right? You would read that, and in your mind you would think, what are they doing? And if you ever had that moment where you've seen somebody do something and you go, what in the world are they doing? That's what officers do. And when they see those furtive gestures, they are conditioned and trained, in my opinion rightfully so, to live in a world where, are they trying to conceal a weapon? Are they trying to conceal a narcotic? What's going on here? And a lot of times officers will exercise that authority that they have to have someone exit the vehicle, and that's when they might find themselves doing a quick pat down, make sure you don't have any weapons on you. But anytime someone has furtive gestures, that's usually the number one reason we're going to pull people out of a car. I don't know what you're grabbing for, but I don't like it. I'm in a full uniform, I'm in a fully marked car. I don't need you grabbing stuff inside that vehicle. And then usually there's a little bit of a tension sometimes from people that want to push back on that. Right? People will say, well, I didn't do anything, I'm not getting out. Well, I'm still conducting the investigation, and in that moment the law is still on law enforcement's side. And the people that, say I'm going to hold on to the steering wheel and I'm not going to get out, it never ends well for them.
Ever.
And the United States Supreme Court has rendered that that's why that does not end well for them. And so no matter what happens.
And sometimes it's just the officer is having a bad day. Because in some cases, when it doesn't end well, it's not always that person's fault. Sometimes it's just the officer that just wants to get a rise out of you, and I'm always telling my kids, for me, I just feel if you get stopped by the police, and let's say this officer is a racist officer, if you already see this officer is on 10, you don't go to 10. You stay right here and comply, because again, I want you to get home safely.
Yes, absolutely.
So I also always tell my daughter, and now I tell my sons, that when a police officer is pulling you over and it's really dark, not to stop. But I always tell them to put your blinkers on, slow down at a really slow pace where they know you're not trying to flee. But I've also gone as far to say, but also call 911 to let them know what's going on and what you're doing. So if something do take place, you already have it on record that you wasn't trying to flee, you was just trying to get to some place that's more lit. But officers, they get upset with that. They get upset. Like my daughter was actually pulled over once, and the officer was really upset, and he was like immediately jumped out the car and was just going off on her and telling her she didn't stop, but she literally just slowed down to get to someplace light, and his first thing was get out the car. And naturally she did, and she called me and put me on speaker just to let me know what was going on. And he asked to search the car. But it's situations like that is the reason I'm always telling them to comply, because you never know what a person is going through, what this person has just dealt with.
Obviously it's very tricky because in law enforcement, it's a very kind of a cut and dry type thing, right? A lot of times in law enforcement, the idea is that officers are kind of trained to look at the issue. This is what I'm going to do, and people are required to do this, right? So anytime that we turn the lights on and you don't immediately start braking and you don't immediately pull over, our minds are going different places. 9 times out of 10, their minds aren't going there, right? So now we're coming at the same encounter from 2 different perspectives, right? So how do we mediate that, right? And the officers sometimes do get amped up because they think that they're probably trying to drive, and that's not always that they think they're fleeing. Are they trying to get rid of something in the car? Are they trying to hide something while they're slow rolling? And you know, and that's the issue behind it, is we're coming from 2 different places. And it's, for me, I've always just found it so helpful to just get to a safe place and have a dialogue. And you know what? If somebody's upset about something that I've done or said, I can accept that. And I wish that people would take time to have those conversations, but a lot of times they don't. And they write it off as, well, I'm the police and you have to do what I said. And some people want to say, well, I told you I didn't do anything and you're out here bugging me, right? And so people are coming from a very difficult place sometimes, and that's a hard gap to kind of stand in and try to navigate, you know what I mean?
Okay, so do you guys you wear body cams as well?
We do, yeah. So body cams were a big push, probably about, I'm gonna say about 11 or 12 years ago. The body cam market was kind of like everything else in technology. Every company was out there was going to invent the best of the best of the best of the best. We actually took a step back and didn't jump into that whole body camera thing for the first several years. We were seeing the technology evolve. We were seeing higher resolution videos, capabilities were coming out. So we were slow to get into the body camera game, but we actually have a very upper end dash camera on all of our cars. And that was something that we were very much impassioned about, telling our officers it had better be on for every single stop that you make, every encounter that you have.
And they have to justify why it's not on. And a lot of people have dash cams now on their car for their safety. And another thing, you know, it's been so much, it's been an incident. And now I want to ask you, when a police officer responds to a 911 call for like domestic violence, and I always go back to how when you guys came to our house, I remember a few years ago when it was a young officer, I think she worked for IMPD, and she, correct me if I'm wrong, she responded to a domestic call and she was shot and killed through the door. So when you go to a house for a domestic call or any 911, once you knock on the door, are you trained to stand off to the side, or is it personal preference? How does that work?
So the officer you're talking about is Brianne Leaf. She was a young officer. She was a very accomplished young officer too. I know some people that actually knew her personally. I never knew her personally. Brianne, her incident itself, while I don't have detailed information about what actually took place there, my understanding is she was doing exactly what she was trained to do. And that training was anytime that we approach a residence, we don't typically knock in front of the door and stand in front of that door. And she was standing off to the side.
So you are supposed to stand off to the side.
Typically that's the strategy.
Because you don't know what's coming.
Correct. We don't know what might come open that door, and if we don't have an opportunity to duck for cover, or if someone comes out with a knife, or with even for a firearm for that matter, it gives you the best opportunity to give you the tactical advantage, right? If someone were to knock on your front door, the idea would we want to stand somewhere where they can't really see where I'm at, because we don't want you knowing where we're at, because it could compromise my safety, right? So when it comes to domestic batteries, comes to domestic incidents like that, it's really not much different than our normal approach. If we come to a house for any other type of report, the habit that you mostly see of officers is they'll knock on the door and they'll come back, they might stand closer to their car, they might stand off to the side, because a lot of times too, it's a situation where we've had to talk about this in law enforcement, is how do we know you're not calling me for a vehicle lockout so you know an officer will show up and then you want to try to hurt somebody? So sometimes we're always very mindful of those sort of things. And so It's a very, very difficult mindset to have every day to be a uniformed officer, because you can become very paranoid. You can become very ostracized. You become a loner, and at times it's hard to have to live like that because you think people are trying to hurt you every day.
Yeah,
and to try to let that guard down is hard for some people. It is hard for people that have been in uniform for 10, 15, 20 years. It's hard for people that are in an agency where they don't really encourage you to be that kind to people. And there's one thing about the criminal element that will be forever known in law enforcement, is that a lot of times criminals will mistake an officer's kindness for a weakness. And a lot of times when you talk to people that have killed a law enforcement officer in the line of duty, if you get them to do an interview and talk about why did you decide to kill that officer, a lot of them will talk to you about their mannerisms. They'll talk about, well, I knew I could take him because he was sloppy in his uniform. Or I knew I could take him, he was just way too kind, and he was handcuffing me in the front and not in the back, which meant he wasn't following his procedures, and he's not following his procedures, he's probably less likely to take training serious. These are the cognitive processes that go through people's minds before they kill police officers. And when you start to learn about that, you have to say, well, what are we learning from that we can now take into our next academy class and try to teach this officer how to go home safe at night, regardless of race, nationality, or any of that.
Now, should you inform, I remember I called 911 once when I thought my alarm was going off, and that's exactly what the officer did. But I also felt safe because of my friendship with you, so I called you to let you know, hey, I just called the police. But the dispatcher asked me, do I have any weapons in the home? And I said no. So you should you reveal that you have a weapon? As a black person, we're not going to reveal that we have a weapon, because chances are that's not going to end well. So if you have a weapon, should you reveal that you have one, or just no?
Are you talking about just in any circumstance, or a vehicle stop, or a home visit, or
both? A vehicle stop and at home.
I will tell you that in Indiana, there is not a requirement for you to disclose that you have a firearm in you, or on your person, or in your car, or in your home. So there's no state law in Indiana. Now, some laws in some states are different. If you're watching this from a different state, you're saying, well, that's different. I've got a different law where I live at, states that I have to disclose that. I will tell you that we talked a little bit earlier about best practices, right? We talked about for safety, exactly. Now, if I only live in a world where I only do what I'm required to do, there might be some shortcomings from that, right? For me, I have found, my experience is that most officers appreciate when someone just says, I just want you to know I have a firearm in the glove box.
After you get out the car.
That would be helpful. That'd be helpful. Yeah.
It's best to wait till after you get out the car and then disclose that.
And also, but think about different circumstances. What if my firearm is in the glove box, and now you're asking me to open the glove box and give you the registration? That's probably a good time to say.
That's probably a good
I want you to know when I open
exactly.
up, you're going to see a firearm in there. And most of the time, officers will say, I appreciate you telling me that, and they'll just be more attentive to it, but they will respect you for that. And they will kind of de-escalate that situation, right? So again, are you required to do that? No. But is it best practice? I don't like to be surprised when I come across a firearm, but at the same time, I understand it's not a requirement for people to do so. So to your example about a dispatch run here at your house, if someone were to say, hey, here's a dispatch run I've got, I'm on my way to the scene, the dispatchers are asking that, but they're not asking it for any other reason, just to make sure that if you come to the front door, that officer knows that you don't have a weapon in your hand. That's all that's for. That is all that's for. And a lot of times people have prowlers, they have burglar type calls. Hey, somebody's out messing around with my car. A lot of people will go out with a handgun in their car or in their hand. And when they go out there to make that encounter, all of a sudden I see a marked unit pulling up. That marked unit doesn't know that you're the homeowner or you're the suspect. All right, so they get out and they're just, oh my gosh, why do you have a handgun in your hand? And so a lot of times it's protocol for dispatchers to ask questions about, do you have any weapons in the home? Do you have any weapons on you? So a good way to answer that is that if you don't want to jeopardize that you have weapons in the home and they ask you the question, you say, I don't have any weapons on me.
Okay.
All right, so you're not required to answer that question, even on a traffic stop, especially in the state of Indiana.
But definitely on a traffic stop, you should never have it out in the open. It should definitely always be concealed.
We would prefer it to be concealed. Now,
so are police officers trained to shoot first and ask questions later?
No. Police officers are trained to gather information at every moment in time to make an informed decision. A lot of times when we start to hear about police action shootings in the news, when we start hearing about incidents being involving an officer and another individual being involved, the biggest issue that we have to be mindful of is what information did the officer know when they got on scene. As a perfect example, we talked earlier about having information on a hazard for an address, right? Mm-hmm. If I were to get out of the vehicle and someone comes and starts yelling and screaming and they looks like they have a weapon and they say, "We're going to kill me," in the moment, in the media's world, they have no idea what led up to that. You have no idea if that person had threatened law enforcement in the past. You have no idea if they've had a history of hurting law enforcement in the past. We don't know what was said on the 911 recording. We don't know any of that. And so when officers are responding to scenes, if you know an officer that's been involved in a line of duty death, or not line of duty death, but a line of duty police action shooting, you know that that's not something anyone wants to go through. They just don't. And that's what's such a difficult conversation to have with some people, because that's the feeling, right? Like you said earlier, with the experience that you and I had at your house, like you were kind of living in a world where you were expecting doors to be broken down and you were expecting throwing, but the reality is
I was like, "Tony, the police is at the door."
But in that moment, that's what your expectation was, right?
Heart is racing.
Absolutely. But there are so many well-documented incidents where officers are involved in shootings and they're justified. And it's the totality of circumstances. That's a big phrase you hear in law enforcement all the time. What's the totality of the circumstances? That totality of the circumstances might be the time of day, what the lighting was like, what you knew at the time, what they said, how they acted, how you responded, what you knew. An officer can only be held accountable for what they knew in that moment. And so we try to condition officers to send those emails for officer safety so that way we know what's going on. We try to condition officers to put hazards into the CAD system so that way the next dispatch run comes out, they're aware of what's going on. We're trying to encourage officers about de-escalation. There is a group here in Hendricks County, and it's really becoming quite popular across the Midwest United States. It's CIT training, it's crisis intervention training. Mm-hmm. And what that training does is it empowers officers to know all of the local resources that they can use, because arresting people is not the only resolution that we have in law enforcement.
Right.
It's just not.
Arresting people, killing people.
It's never the only resolution.
It has to be another resolution.
Yeah. If we know that somebody, you take a child for example, take a child that continues to run away from home. We need to start asking some questions. Well, why are they running away from home?
What's going on?
Are they being battered? Are they not being fed? Are they being placed in fear? Are they running from something, or are they running to something else? And that's what takes that investigative mind of an officer to sit down and ask questions. But here's one for you. How do we not know this child has a cognitive disorder? Are we talking about that? Because at this point, if I now charge a kiddo with running away from home, or we start pulling them into the criminal justice system for something like that, if the real reason that they're running is because they're being neglected, or there's an undiagnosed cognitive disorder, we're not doing our job. So we do have CIT training. We do work with a lot of organizations that help officers identify, this is what this looks like. If you think you have it, call this person at this phone number and start asking some questions. Now before I leave your house, maybe I'll leave you a business card and I say, hey, give so-and-so a call. They might be able to help you out with this. We're really big on that here at Avon. And I think the more forward-looking agencies,
they're adopting that same policy.
Yeah, I think a lot of them are realizing that's the only way to go right now, is to slow down. Let's just ask some more questions. Let's use more resources. Okay. It's proven pretty effective.
You know, police are always saying, see something, say something. And the code on the street is a lot like the code of blue. You know, if you snitch, you get killed or hurt, or your family member. But officers don't take their own advice. Like officers, when something happens and the officers know it's wrong, why don't officers speak out more against another police officer when they know this situation is wrong, or this shouldn't have happened this way? Like, why don't they speak out more? Like, see something, say something.
It's a great question, but the preface of your question too, I want to talk about just for a minute first, right? We live in a world where we would have no way of quantifying how often that happens. Now, we can make assumptions, right? We can make assumptions that it's happening all the time, or twice a day, or whatever. The reality is we don't really know what that looks like unless you're an inside perspective, right? So it really goes back to what we talked a couple times about today, is what's that culture look like? What does that culture look like? Does it empower us? I would tell you from my experience, I've been on the end of reporting wrongdoing by officers several times, and it's not a comfortable thing to have to do, but I've lived and worked in an environment in an agency that I knew that doing that was going to prevail, and it wasn't going to result in someone coming after me or trying to get me fired or losing my career.
Not defending you when you go on the traffic stop or a 911 call.
And that's a nice part about body cams and dash cams too, is they hold officers accountable. And you and I and most people that we know would probably agree that if you're going to act a particular way, you're going to act a particular way. But if I put a body camera on you, are you going to maybe be a little bit better? Yeah, probably so. And that's okay. That's okay. That's how we make things better, is by making some adjustments and being willing to look at those adjustments and say, okay, I'm okay with that. Everything's documented in what I say. But a lot of it comes down to culture. You know, do you have an agency that allows anonymous complaints to come in? Mm-hmm. Do you have an internal investigative mechanism that will take those and document that they came in and somebody did X, Y, and Z and tried to look at that? Because we also deal with an apprehension from the public. Hey, I want to call in. I want to tell you that the guy that did that shooting is John Smith. I want to tell you where he works at. I want to tell you what he drives, but I don't want to give you too much information because it might come back on me, right? So you just say John Smith. And as a detective, if I get that tip in the email and I go, okay, they're saying John Smith is the one that did our shooting. Well, crap. What, is that all we got? Do we have a date of birth for John? Do we know what neighborhood he lives in? Do we know where he works at? So sometimes there's that apprehension. It's like, man, I appreciate someone giving me that, but give me a little bit more, right? Mm-hmm. Give me a little bit more. With Crime Stoppers of Central Indiana, what I learned years ago was fascinating to me, is that if you call in a tip in Crime Stoppers, let's say you call it in or you shoot an email or whatever, before that tip even makes it to an investigator's hand, mm-hmm. they ship all of that data electronically out of the country.
Really?
They scrub it of all of the abilities to track where it came from, and then they send it back to the United States.
Really?
And then they send that to the police agency.
Wow.
So when that tip comes in,
so
we have...
people can call Crime Stoppers knowing that.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, right? Is you can know that in their 29 or 30 some plus years, they have not given up the identity of one tipster. And it's because of the mechanism that they have in place. So, you know, when people say they have tips, I could open up a phone line, I could open up an email address, but my go-to response is Crime Stoppers, because knowing that that's how their system works, right. and that they scrub that, even if I'm like, man, I think we got the right guy, I believe it is John Smith, I think whoever this person is they know it, man, I wish that I could reach out to them, but I can't, and that's just the way that it works. So now Crime Stoppers does have the ability to respond to their messages and ask questions, but it's not something that they can certainly have any control over. But it all happens through that system that they have in place, and so
police officers can call Crime Stoppers as well.
They could, yes, they absolutely could, yeah.
Because every agency isn't like Avon.
Yeah.
You know, the bigger agencies, you know, they have that code of blue, but. You know, I so appreciate you for being here. I'm always telling, you know, my kids they're more good officers than bad. You know, the media tends to highlight the worst of the worst, and and you think that's the majority when it's really the minority. But you're proof of that, and I so appreciate you for being here and
thank you for
having this conversation with me for interaction with the police, because interaction with the police is so important. You know, it used to be officer friendlies, and we don't have officer friendlies anymore. You know, we had the neighborhood police officer, we had officer friendly, so I really appreciate you for being here. Thanks for watching Let's Talk It Out. Please make sure to hit that like button, share, and subscribe to my channel. Tune in next week for another episode of Let's Talk It Out. Thanks for watching.